Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of our English Learning podcast. I'm Jennifer, and as always, I'm here with my wonderful co-host, Elizabeth. How are you today, Elizabeth?
Hi, Jennifer. I'm doing well, thank you. Today's topic is one that affects many teens and their families. Does peer pressure absolve delinquent teens from culpability? Teenagers often face intense peer pressure to fit in, and sometimes that pressure can lead them to engage in delinquent or even illegal activities. But does the influence of their peers reduce their responsibility for these actions? Can we blame peer pressure, or should teens be held fully accountable for their choices? Today, we'll explore both sides of this debate and look at the role peer pressure plays in shaping behavior.
That's right, Elizabeth. Peer pressure is something almost every teenager experiences at some point, whether it's pressure to try new things, take risks, or behave in ways they wouldn't normally consider. But when peer pressure leads to delinquent behavior, like theft, vandalism, or drug use, the question becomes more complicated. Should we view teens as victims of their social environment, or are they fully responsible for their actions, regardless of the influence of others? It's a complex issue, and today we'll be diving into the psychological, legal, and ethical aspects of this debate.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Do you think peer pressure reduces a teen's responsibility for their actions, or should they be held fully accountable? Share your opinions with us, and we might even feature them in a future episode. So, Jennifer, let's start by discussing the impact of peer pressure on teenage behavior. How does peer pressure influence teens, and why is it such a powerful force?
Well, Elizabeth, during adolescence, teens are at a stage where they're developing their identity and trying to figure out where they fit in socially. As a result, they're highly sensitive to the opinions and behaviors of their peers. Peer approval becomes incredibly important, and many teens feel a strong need to conform to the expectations of their friend groups in order to feel accepted. This can lead to risky or delinquent behavior if those in their social circle engage in such activities, as teens might feel pressure to follow along in order to maintain their social standing.
That's such an important point, Jennifer. The desire for social acceptance can be overwhelming for teens, and in many cases, they'll prioritize fitting in over making the right choices. Peer pressure can take many forms. It can be explicit, like being directly asked or dared to do something, or it can be implicit, where teens feel the need to conform simply because everyone else is doing it. This pressure can lead to behaviors that they might not engage in on their own, including delinquent acts like skipping school, shoplifting, or experimenting with drugs.
Exactly, Elizabeth. And what's interesting is that peer pressure doesn't always have to be overt. Sometimes, just the fear of being excluded or judged by their peers is enough to push teens into making poor decisions. Research has shown that the brain's reward system is highly sensitive during adolescence, and peer approval can trigger that system, making teens more likely to take risks or engage in delinquent behavior when they're in a group setting. The influence of peers can make them more impulsive and less likely to consider the long-term consequences of their actions.
Absolutely, Jennifer. This is one of the reasons why peer pressure is so powerful. Teens are more likely to focus on the immediate rewards of fitting in or being seen as cool, rather than thinking about the potential negative consequences, such as getting into trouble with the law or damaging their reputation. In these situations, the presence of peers can cloud their judgment and lead them to act in ways they wouldn't if they were alone.
So, from a psychological standpoint, we can see that peer pressure has a profound impact on teenage behavior. But the question remains, does this influence absolve teens from responsibility for their actions? Should we hold them less accountable if they were acting under the influence of peer pressure, or does personal responsibility still apply, regardless of the circumstances?
That's the key question, Jennifer. Let's start by discussing the arguments in favor of reducing a teen's culpability when peer pressure is involved. One of the main arguments is that teens are still in the process of developing their decision-making abilities and impulse control. The adolescent brain is not fully mature, particularly in areas related to self-regulation and long-term thinking. Because of this, some people argue that teens are more vulnerable to outside influences, including peer pressure, and that this should be taken into account when evaluating their culpability for delinquent acts.
That's such an important point, Elizabeth. Research in neuroscience has shown that the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for decision-making, impulse control, and understanding the consequences of one's actions, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. This means that teens are more likely to make impulsive decisions, especially when they're under pressure from their peers. Proponents of this view argue that because teens are still developing these critical cognitive functions, they shouldn't be held to the same standard of accountability as adults when it comes to delinquent behavior influenced by peer pressure.
Exactly, Jennifer. Another argument for reducing culpability is that peer pressure can create an environment where teens feel they have no choice but to go along with the group. In some cases, the pressure to conform can be so intense that it feels like coercion, especially if there's a fear of being ostracized or bullied for refusing to participate. In this view, the social dynamics of peer pressure can significantly limit a teen's ability to make an independent decision, and this should be considered when determining their responsibility for delinquent acts.
Absolutely, Elizabeth. In situations where peer pressure is particularly strong, teens may feel like they're caught between a rock and a hard place. Either they participate in the delinquent behavior, or they risk being excluded or ridiculed by their peers. This can lead to feelings of powerlessness or even fear, making it difficult for them to resist the pressure. Proponents of this view argue that when teens act under these conditions, their actions are less a reflection of their own moral choices and more a response to the social dynamics they're navigating.
That's such a great point, Jennifer. And beyond the psychological and social aspects, there's also the argument that punishing teens harshly for behavior influenced by peer pressure might not be the most effective approach. Some people argue that instead of focusing on punishment, we should focus on rehabilitation and helping teens understand the impact of their actions. They believe that because peer pressure plays such a significant role in adolescent decision-making, addressing the root causes of delinquency, like peer influence, lack of positive role models, or a need for social belonging, can be more beneficial than assigning blame.
Exactly, Elizabeth. The idea here is that if we recognize the influence of peer pressure in delinquent behavior, we can create interventions that address the social factors that lead teens down this path. Instead of simply punishing them, we can help them develop better decision-making skills, build stronger self-esteem, and learn how to resist negative peer pressure in the future. By focusing on rehabilitation and support, rather than just accountability, we can reduce the likelihood that teens will continue engaging in delinquent behavior.
So, from the perspective of those who believe that peer pressure should reduce a teen's culpability, the key arguments are that teens are still developing their decision-making abilities, peer pressure can create coercive environments, and a focus on rehabilitation might be more effective than punishment. But, of course, not everyone agrees with this approach. Let's now talk about the arguments for holding teens fully accountable for their actions, even when peer pressure is involved.
Well, Elizabeth, one of the main arguments in favor of holding teens fully accountable is that personal responsibility is a fundamental part of growing up. While it's true that peer pressure can be a powerful influence, it doesn't completely remove a teen's ability to make their own choices. Proponents of this view argue that teens, like all individuals, have the ability to choose between right and wrong, and that they should be held accountable for the decisions they make, even when those decisions are influenced by their peers.
That's such an important point, Jennifer. The idea of moral agency is central to this argument. Even though teens are still developing, they're not completely incapable of understanding the difference between right and wrong. In this view, peer pressure is just one factor in a teen's decision-making process, and it doesn't excuse them from the consequences of their actions. Teens are to learn the importance of responsibility and accountability. They need to face the repercussions of their behavior, regardless of whether they were influenced by their peers.
Exactly, Elizabeth. Another argument for holding teens accountable is that excusing delinquent behavior due to peer pressure could send the wrong message. If we allow teens to blame their peers for their actions, we risk teaching them that they can avoid responsibility by shifting the blame onto others. Proponents of this view argue that part of growing up is learning to take ownership of one's decisions, and that holding teens fully accountable, even when peer pressure is involved, helps reinforce this lesson.
Absolutely, Jennifer. If we start excusing certain behaviors because of peer pressure, we might create a culture where teens feel less responsible for their actions and more willing to engage in risky or delinquent behavior, knowing they can avoid full accountability. By holding teens responsible, we send a clear message that their choices matter and that they have to face the consequences of those choices, regardless of the social dynamics involved.
That's such a great point, Elizabeth. And beyond the issue of personal responsibility, there's also the argument that peer pressure is a common experience that doesn't always lead to delinquent behavior. Many teens face peer pressure but still manage to make positive choices and avoid getting into trouble. Proponents of this view argue that if other teens can resist peer pressure and make responsible decisions, then those who give in to it should be held accountable for their actions. They believe that peer pressure shouldn't be used as an excuse for bad behavior.
Exactly, Jennifer. The fact that some teens can resist peer pressure shows that it's possible to make the right choice even in difficult situations. Proponents of this view argue that giving in to peer pressure is still a choice, and those who choose to engage in delinquent behavior should be held accountable for that decision. They believe that peer pressure is not an excuse for wrongdoing and that teens should be taught to take responsibility for their actions regardless of the influence of their peers.
So, from the perspective of those who believe that teens should be fully accountable for their actions, the key arguments are that personal responsibility is essential. Excusing behavior due to peer pressure sends the wrong message, and many teens are able to resist peer pressure and make responsible choices. As we can see, there are strong arguments on both sides of this debate.
Absolutely, Jennifer. And speaking of different perspectives, I think it's a great time to hear from one of our listeners. Let's take a call from someone who might have an interesting perspective on whether peer pressure absolves delinquent teens from culpability.
Hi there, you're on the air with Jennifer and Elizabeth. What's your name, and where are you calling from?
Hi, Jennifer. Hi, Elizabeth. My name is Ryan, and I'm calling from Denver, Colorado. I've been listening to your podcast for a while now, and I love today's topic. I wanted to share my thoughts because I work as a youth counselor, and I see firsthand how peer pressure affects teens.
Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for calling in. We'd love to hear more about your experience working with teens. How do you see peer pressure influencing their behavior, and do you think it absolves them of responsibility for delinquent acts?
Well, peer pressure definitely plays a huge role in the decisions that teens make, especially when it comes to delinquent behavior. A lot of the teens I work with get involved in things like shoplifting or drug use because they feel pressure from their friends or they're trying to fit in. But at the same time, I think it's important to hold them accountable. In my experience, when teens understand that their choices have consequences, they're more likely to make better decisions in the future.
That's such a valuable perspective, Ryan. It sounds like you recognize the role peer pressure plays, but you also believe that accountability is important for helping teens learn from their mistakes. Do you think there's a way to balance understanding the influence of peer pressure while still holding teens responsible for their actions?
Definitely. I think the key is education and support. We need to teach teens how to recognize and resist negative peer pressure, while also helping them understand that they're still responsible for their choices. It's about finding that balance, acknowledging the role of peer pressure, but also emphasizing personal responsibility.
That's such great insight, Ryan. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with us.
Thanks for having me. I love listening to your podcast, and I'm excited to hear more episodes.
Thanks so much for calling in, Ryan. Take care.
Bye, Ryan.
That was a great call from Ryan. He really highlighted the importance of acknowledging peer pressure while also teaching teens the value of accountability and responsible decision-making.
Absolutely, Jennifer. And for those of you listening, if you're enjoying our podcast, please like and subscribe to our channel. Your support really helps us keep creating these episodes and sharing more interesting topics with you.
So, where does that leave us in our discussion today? I think it's clear that peer pressure is a powerful influence on teenage behavior, but it doesn't necessarily absolve teens from responsibility. On one hand, peer pressure can limit a teen's ability to make independent decisions, and their cognitive development is still ongoing. On the other hand, personal responsibility and accountability are essential lessons that teens need to learn as they grow into adulthood.
Exactly, Jennifer. Key takeaway is that while peer pressure plays a significant role in shaping teenage behavior, it doesn't remove the need for personal accountability. Teens need guidance, support, and education to help them navigate peer pressure, but they also need to understand that their choices have consequences, and they're responsible for those choices.
We hope today's discussion has given you some new insights into the question of whether peer pressure absolves delinquent teens from culpability. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you for listening. We're always here to share new insights and help you learn English while exploring important topics like this one. Keep listening, keep learning, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye for now, everyone. And remember, peer pressure is a part of life, but learning to make the right choices is what helps us grow into responsible adults.